Iraq was a initial success, the toppling of a horrible dictatorship, and the opening up of a possibility of a new strategic alignment in the Middle East, followed by a catastrophic 4-year occupation where we did everything wrong, followed by an unbelievable success of the surge, which really snatched a victory from the jaws of defeat, followed by throwing it all away.
Let's fast forward a little bit to the Iraq invasion. Obviously, part of the reaction of the left to what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan has to do with the hostility or alienation from American exceptionalism that you were just talking about.
Right.
Looking back on it now, how do you evaluate Iraq? As a success, as a failure?
Iraq was a initial success, the toppling of a horrible dictatorship, and the opening up of a possibility of a new strategic alignment in the Middle East, followed by a catastrophic 4-year occupation where we did everything wrong, followed by an unbelievable success of the surge, which really snatched a victory from the jaws of defeat, followed by throwing it all away. As David Petraeus said in a remarkably candid interview just this week, meaning a week of mid-March in 2015, in which he said, after the surge, which ended around 2008, we were able to maintain the gains for 3 years until the end of 2011. Well, what happened at the end of 2011? We totally liquidated our presence, creating a vacuum into which Iran has come, into which Shiite extremism, Shiite militias came. The day after we withdrew, January 2nd, 2012, President Maliki, Prime Minister Maliki, the Shiite Prime Minister of Iraq, not only fired but ordered the arrest of his Sunni Prime Minister. The Americans are gone. Now we do our score settling. 10,000 troops. Petraeus was asked, would that have made a difference? Stopped ISIS from invading. Remember, ISIS ancestor was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was not only defeated in the surge, it was humiliated in the surge when the Sunni Arabs of Anbar, who were the aggrieved party, who had a reason to be anti-American because the Sunnis had ruled Iraq for 100 years and we had overthrown that, and who initially joined with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they turned against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They joined us, the infidel. That was the ultimate humiliation, to be thrown out of Iraq and to be decimated by an alliance of the infidel with the local Sunnis. That's what the surge produced. And what people don't remember today is that in the spring of 2008, after we and the Iraqi Sunnis took care of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, on the Sunni side, Maliki, who was not the best guy in the world, went to war against the Badr brigades, the Shiite, Iranian-influenced militias, defeated them in Basra, fought them all the way up through Karbala and Najaf into Sadr city itself, and utterly destroyed them. So he took care of the Shiite extremists. We and the Anbar awakening took care of the Sunnis. And there was great promise, and that was thrown away. A vacuum was created. There were no Americans around to moderate, to mediate as we had. So it was a success, a failure, a success, and an unconscionable throwing away of success.
And how long would Americans have had to be around to assure its success?
Well, 10,000 Americans. We've had 4 times that many in Korea for about 65 years, if I have that correct. We had a lot in Germany, a lot, of course, still in Japan. It wasn't as if it was an ongoing war. Obama himself said, as he announced the withdrawal, that we have a fairly stable and secure Iraq. It was holding together. It had promise. Now, like Petraeus, I'm not going to say we would have, succeeded in producing a Jeffersonian democracy, but we had made tremendous advances, and there was a possibility. And I think it's a great tragedy that we didn't. Petraeus said, "I can't tell you if that would have done it, but I would like to have had the chance to try."
Nonetheless, the experience leaves a bad taste in
Experience
the American
has
mouth.
produced the Vietnam syndrome all over again.
And so what do we do in Syria now? The choices are not particularly good.
Well, the choices today are nil. There were choices early on, and Obama rejected the advice of his own CIA director, his own Secretary of Defense, his own Secretary of State, of the Intelligence Committee, everybody.
Who was then Hillary?
Well, Hillary Clinton herself, in not supporting the rebels, the revolution, when it was still overwhelmingly secular and when it had tremendous chances of success. I remember at one point early on, first year, there were rumors that Assad had already sent the family out of Syria. Remember the blowing up of the meeting of their security apparatus in Damascus. The rebels controlled a large part. Now the secular rebels have been so marginalized, they're essentially gone. We have to create something from nothing. So I think Syria is irredeemable. The only thing that could happen in Syria that would succeed, the Turks are very much afraid of and opposed to the Assad regime, and they're essentially in a proxy war with Iran, which controls the Assad regime. They see themselves as the new Ottomans. They ought to be the hegemon over a Sunni Arab world instead of the Iranians. That's an offense. But they won't join us unless we say to them that we are equally opposed to Assad. We have said to the Turks, we want you to help us in Kobani to fight ISIS. And they say, we'll help you, but you can't give Assad a pass because that's our real fear and opponent, and we won't do that. So they're out of it. It's the Turks who could succeed in bringing down the Assad regime, but we're not going to do what they need us to do to deal with it.
So if we did what Charles Krauthammer recommends, we would be in a position of an offshore balancer, essentially. Let the regional powers settle this themselves with our intervention or our finger on the scale only if necessary.
That's been American policy everywhere for 75 years, and it has had remarkable success. Who is the offshore balancer in the Pacific Rim? China, and then you've got all these Pacific Rim countries that are pro-American, they're relatively democratic, they're being threatened. We have the U.S. Navy. That's what creates the balance, and that's what keeps the peace. In the 1960s and 70s and the 80s, we were the balancer of last resort in the Middle East. At some point, sometimes you have to step in. In 91, Saddam takes over Kuwait. He threatens to become the hegemon of the entire oil patch, Middle East, on which the Western economy depends. And the regional powers are not strong enough to do anything. And George H.W. Bush says, this will not stand. And he says, I'm going in alone or with allies. And he accumulated a huge alliance because they knew that we were serious. So that's been our role everywhere as the offshore balancer. In a sense, that's the NATO story. The Russians were overwhelmingly conventionally superior at the end of the Second World War. They could have gone all the way to the Atlantic Ocean with their tanks. The reason they didn't is because of us. We were the offshore.
But wouldn't offshore balancing argue against the occupation of Iraq after victory in war?
Well, I'm not sure that's true. Sometimes you have to go in, as we did with the first Gulf War. Sometimes you go in, and it doesn't work out, in part because the initial operation is successful. The threat is eliminated. Saddam and his dynasty is wiped out. The problem in Iraq is there was no clear policy that we had, either to install maybe a Sunni general that we could trust, or to find some way in which we could ensure moderate Shiites. There was a party in Iraq which was sort of a mixed party led by a guy called Alawi, who was himself a Shiite but had a lot of Sunnis, who won the election of 2010. The mission of the Obama administration was to broker a coalition behind them. They gave the job to the vice president, and it will not surprise you to learn that it was an abject failure. And instead of getting this non-sectarian party to become the dominant party and to take over the government, we ended up with the Maliki, which had not won the election, the Maliki party, Iranian influenced and very sectarian. And that was the beginning of the end of this idea of a benign successor government.